Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 ConQast video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today, I'm pleased to present yet another installment in my series of Community Spotlight videos, in which I interview various prominent and upstanding members of the Conquest LCG community. Specifically, we discuss their favorite decks, and how best to pilot some of their favorite warlords. Hopefully, through sharing their personal experience, opinions, and advice, they'll be able to provide you with a host of information useful to both new and veteran players alike. Be sure to let me know what you think of this interview in the comments section below, and as always, I remain ever open to constructive criticism. But with our introduction aside, let's get things started with a discussion of Captain Cato Sicarius. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, but before we discuss the tactical genius behind wearing a suit of power armor sans helmet into battle and maybe get some grief from our good community by daring to play Ultramarines, where might our viewership recognize you from, and how are you involved in our Conquest community?
Yeah, so I'm Davis Kingsley. I went to Worlds last year, and I came in second, losing to Jeremy Zwern in the final match. I'm one of the co-hosts of the Warhammer ConQast, which is, the coolest podcast around. And I've posted a few articles on CardGameDB and on TeamSandCrawler.net under the name Kingsley, my last name.
Sure, and I'll be sure to include relevant links in the description for folks wanting to check out the Concast and get a better idea of who you are. I suppose, what got you involved in Conquest in the first place?
So I had been, I guess this is kind of the story of how I got into LCGs overall, and then how I came from that to Conquest. I had played tabletop 40K when I was a kid, and I'd kind of gotten out of it, and didn't really have a core game that I was playing necessarily. Some of my friends and I had been playing Magic the Gathering, and we were playing very casually. I don't know if you're familiar with the Ravnica setting, where there's like a big city that has all these different guilds and so on.
I've just heard a little bit about it.
Yeah, so we had made very themed decks where we were only allowing cards from the Ravnica block and later the Return to Ravnica block, and each of us picked a guild and only used cards that were thematic to that guild.
Right.
So we had been playing with these very casual but very fun decks, and we started getting more into Magic, and I started looking into what it would cost to start playing Magic on a more competitive level, because I had been kind of missing that. And I found the cost to put together a competitive Magic deck was really high. I think the deck that I wanted to make was 400 or $500.
Yeah, my brother not too long ago bought I think it was a beta or unlimited Black Lotus for, $1,000 or something like that. So the price for even the current cards can be very significant, to say the least.
Yeah, and then the other thing was, I would have this deck and it would be very good for some time, but then it would also rotate out relatively quickly, and I would have to, make that investment again. So I was thinking, this is crazy. I don't want to spend this much on it. And some of the friends that I had at one of the local game stores had been getting into Netrunner. So instead of buying this one Magic deck, I bought, a full playset of every single Netrunner card available at that time, and I started playing Netrunner instead of Magic, getting some of my friends into that. I was pretty dedicated to Netrunner for a while.
Sure.
But then when Conquest came out, I was familiar with the background from my days playing tabletop 40K. And I also just really liked the rules. And Netrunner sort of stole my heart away from Magic, and then Conquest sort of stole my heart away from Netrunner. So I now play Netrunner very infrequently, and am all about Conquest instead.
Well, I suppose, how did you really get started in the competitive scene? I mean, it seems like you've made quite the journey from very casual MTG to almost, world champion, and speaking quite frankly, a lot of players in our community think that you are a serious contender for if not if not the best player in the world, definitely a contender.
Yeah, so a while ago, this was at around a similar time to when I first started getting into Netrunner. I had graduated from college, and I used to play like a large amount of games, but like I didn't play any of them all that seriously per se.
Sure.
And I've always been like interested in games and pretty good at games, but I never really like invested a lot of time into one thing. And I kind of made a deal with myself where I said that I was going to start playing fewer games, but I was going to take the games that I did play more seriously and like kind of play on a more competitive level, because this would be a way that I could like net decrease the amount of time I had for games now that I have like more responsibilities and so on.
Right.
But at the same time, play those games on kind of a higher and to some extent more fulfilling level. So that's what I did. And, I was a pretty good Netrunner player. I won one of the plugged-in events. I typically did quite well in most of the events that I went to for Netrunner. I was actually planning to go to Worlds last year to play in Netrunner Worlds.
Mm-hmm.
But, and I had like got my ticket planning on that and so on. But by the time Worlds actually rolled around, Conquest had come out, and I got so into Conquest that I did not play. I think after Conquest came out, the number of games of Netrunner I've played is like maybe 5 or 6. So I did very little preparation for Netrunner Worlds, and then I won my first games in Swiss, but it turned out the Netrunner Worlds Swiss was going to overlap with the Conquest Finals. So after playing the first round of Swiss, I just dropped from Netrunner and used the time to, rest up and get prepared for the final battles in Conquest.
Sure. Well, I don't think anybody could dare fault you there. What exactly is it about Conquest, though, apart from your history with Tabletop 40K, that really appealed to you? Like, what pulled you away from Netrunner?
So Netrunner has a lot of good things going for it, and I do like the game. That being said, Conquest has some features that I think that I don't see in Netrunner that I really like. For instance, in Conquest your cards are much more multi-purpose. In Netrunner, cards have a relatively defined role. Like there's some exceptions, especially for Corp, where you can use mini cards for bluffing. But like if you have a piece of ice, there's one thing you can do with it, which is you can put it down in front of your server.
Right.
And you can choose to res it or not res it, and there's like some bluffing and tactics with that. But there's only one context in which that card can be used.
Sure.
In Conquest, every card has multiple uses, or almost every card does. You see a few like, there are some supports, and there are some supports that are very straightforward. You can only really do one thing with them. There are some units that don't have command icons and are only really useful for combat. Mm-hmm. But the vast majority of the cards that are going to be in almost any serious Conquest deck are going to be units that have command icons, which means you can use them either for combat or for economy, or they're going to be events and attachments which can both be played for their card effects or used as shields. And I really like that versatility and the ability to like do different sorts of strategies with the cards that you have. There's a lot of flexibility there.
Right.
The one other thing I really like about Conquest relative to Netrunner is that in Netrunner, the way that the game works is that the runner's trying to steal agendas, and if they can successfully get the agendas from the corp, they score them. This sometimes leads to situations that are kind of luck-based, or situations where, like, on average, one person is supposed to win, but the cards just don't come out that way. Mm-hmm. Like, I've had games as corp where the runner was getting into my servers all the time and just not getting lucky and just, like, not finding the things. I had a game where the, I have 5 cards in my hand, 3 of them are agendas, and if the person pulls one of them, they win. And if they don't, I win on the next turn. And, they get into HU like 3 times, so they get 3 out of 5 shots and miss all of them, and I win the game.
Sure.
And, like, Conquest, Conquest's still a card game. There's definitely going to be some variance. There's going to be, there's still random discards. There's still card draw. There's still stuff like Drop Pod Assault where you don't really know what it's going to give you. But the core victory conditions feel less random to me, and I tend to think that Conquest is a somewhat more rewards play skill relative to matchups and to luck. I do think that Conquest is probably going to become somewhat more matchup dependent as we see more cards in the pool, but at least for now, I feel like almost every game is decided on player skill.
Well, I definitely agree in that there seems to be a complete host of different options available to players based upon ally selection, deck construction, what kind of cards you do opt to include. Like you mentioned that you enjoy the fact that cards have multiple purposes. They're not strictly combat. They're also, at times, used to win command, and there's a spatial sense. So I definitely appreciate that this game is probably as far away from a dice involving element as is possible to see in a card game, just because it seems like so much of winning a game is indeed down to careful player actions or mistakes, and there definitely seems to be a rather high skill ceiling that one of these days I'll work my way slowly toward, but I suppose in doing these community spotlights, I've been having people come on and represent one of their personal preferences, one of their favorite warlords. Definitely our card pool has changed and evolved over time, but one strong competitive contender from the very beginning has been Captain Cato Sicarius of the Space Marines faction, and you were kind enough to come on and volunteer for this interview to represent our Ultramarine option. But what is particularly appealing to you about Cato? Even if he's not your number one guy nowadays, why would anyone play him in the first place?
Yeah, so I think first off, I think if you look at the regionals results, I think you can find that there are several warlords that I would put in the top tier. Broadly speaking, you see I believe 5 or 6 warlords that have each won a good number of regionals, and those are Cato, Ragnar, Eldorath, Kith, Zerathur, and Aunshi. So that's 6 warlords who have won more than 2 regionals.
Sure.
I believe. So if you're looking just in terms of like who's up there getting the wins, Cato is definitely one of the ones up there. But more than that, and I think the reason you would want to pick him over the other warlords in the top tier, right, at least for me, is that Cato is, in my opinion, probably the most flexible of any of those warlords. He has cards that can deal with basically any situation, and he has very few bad matchups as a result of his flexibility. So Ragnar, I think Ragnar, the other Space Marine warlord, is also a strong choice, and in fact, I've been playing Ragnar over Cato. Right. But I think that Cato has a little bit more flexibility and a little bit more ability to deal effectively with some of the larger card units out there. You're not seeing those too frequently these days, but if you do see them, Cato has a better ability to deal with those than Ragnar. And in general, he has a very flexible and adaptive playstyle. You're going to have cards that can be useful in almost every situation, and you're going to have answers in your deck for almost anything someone else plays. So that's quite good. He also has one of the best signature attachments in the game, the Talisarian Tempest Blade, and a very common style of deck in the early days, which is what both Jeremy Zwern and myself were using in that final game at Worlds, was a Space Marines with Tau allies deck where you can play 3 Earthcase Technician, and the Technician search effect then allows you to get that Tempest Blade out as soon as you can, and playing it, especially in that relatively early stage where there are fewer Warlord Hunt abilities, right, made it so that you were extremely lethal. These days, I think the advantage of that particular interaction has diminished a bit, but I think it would be remiss to talk about Cato without mentioning his extremely strong signature attachment.
Well, most definitely. I suppose, what has influenced you nowadays to start to opt to pick Ragnar above and beyond Cato?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So for me, by far the biggest thing has been that Cato is better against big units thanks to Fury of Sicarius and Sicarius' Chosen. Right. There have been 2 main things that have caused me to kind of move away from that. The first one is that the card Crushing Blow came out. Crushing Blow is a really strong card for both Space Marine warlords, but I find that Fury of Sicarius is a little bit redundant with Crushing Blow, because a lot of the situations are ones where it's just like, oh, I just want to get that extra point of damage in.
Certainly.
And in that situation, you could pay 2 for it with Fury, or you could pay 0 for it with Crushing Blow, and Crushing Blow is going to sound a lot better. So I think that Fury offered more utility in the early phase before Crushing Blow became more useful for the low end.
Hmm.
And then on the high end, you still have Sicarius' Chosen and Fury to deal with the big guys, but those big guys have been much less prevalent in the meta recently.
Certainly. I mean, it just seems like comparing Crushing Blow to Fury of Sicarius, Crushing Blow is certainly the more valuable option if you're looking to spare as many resources as possible, just because our current meta does favor, very small HP value units played in large numbers.
Yeah, so then also, in that meta where there's a bunch of small units, Ragnar's reaction becomes something that can easily snipe off enemy units and will often like snipe command for you if your warlords both go to the same place.
Right.
You can use Ragnar's reaction not on their warlord but on their unit, which I almost always advocate doing. And if that unit dies and you get command, you can like suddenly have a swing there and win a planet you weren't going to win otherwise. Um,
Definitely.
so I think Ragnar is better against kind of the low end, but it's also the case that he has fewer answers against the high end. And I think that if you don't know whether or not people will be using big unit decks, and there are definitely some good big unit decks out there, Cato is a more balanced choice than Ragnar. And he's going to reliably be pretty good in basically any matchup, whereas Ragnar has a few matchups where he struggles a little bit more. And those are uncommon matchups. So I think taking the gamble and playing Ragnar for the higher percentage against the rest of the field might be good, but I think that Cato just has that versatility. I think it would be very hard to fault someone for picking Cato in almost any environment. I am not sure what cards could come out that would cause Cato to be a bad choice in a tournament.
Well, I suppose, are there any specific matchups where Kato really excels, where he really does manage to shine through him and his signature squad? What would you say the absolute, best odds of walking away the victor might be?
I love playing Cato against decks that are using big units and are using just like a lot of normal damage and brute force. For that reason, I think Cato is very good against like orcs and against big unit chaos decks
Sure.
because, they play a big unit and you move them away with Sicarius' Chosen and don't have to deal with them until later. Or
Right.
they play a big unit and you can get, even if one damage goes through, that Fury can come up. And now, instead of thinking this is a bad value compared to Crushing Blow when I'm only trying to get that last point of damage, if it's a Helldrake and you're doing like 7 points of damage at once from like a scout attack or something, that's huge. That's a massive swing.
Definitely. And it certainly instills a sense of fear into your opponent where you can maybe force them to expend a shield card that they'd have maybe otherwise held on to.
Yeah. And
So,
and do you even have Fury? You might not. I've had games where I've made people waste huge amounts of shields by like bluffing attacks against strong units that don't make sense unless I have Fury.
right.
And that can really pay off. I think that Cato loves to see decks with big units, and he loves to see decks that have big units and just like straightforward damage because you can also use Indomitable, one of the best Space Marine cards, to block that damage on your own guys.
Definitely. I suppose, are there any matchups where Kato doesn't fare quite so well? Like, what kind of situation, be it faction or warlord, poses the greatest challenge for him to try to surmount or overcome?
Yeah, Cato's pretty balanced, so he doesn't have to worry about that type of stuff as much as most others do. But I think that Eldorath is perhaps slightly advantaged against him. The reason for that being that Eldorath has the ability to use Nullify to cancel some of the big events that Cato has to play.
Right.
And additionally, I think that generally speaking, in a matchup between Eldorath and Ragnar, Ragnar has an ability that's somewhat similar to Eldorath, so if you go to the same planet, you can often use that ability to pick off one of Eldorath's guys, just
Sure.
as he's going to exhaust one of your guys, but Cato doesn't have an ability that's like as active in that respect, which can lead you to a disadvantaged situation if both lords go to the same planet. I also think that the matchup against Kith is not necessarily as good as that of Ragnar, and the reason behind that is that Sicarius is chosen. Kith doesn't really play any big units. She does play a lot of shields, so using Sicarius is chosen to try to snipe a 1 HP unit is pretty risky because they might well shield it.
Certainly.
And then I would much rather have Ragnar's lower cost curve with his 2-cost signature unit and so on than Cato's more expensive cost curve against Kith. Furthermore, the way that the having 7 HP is great for Ragnar, and having that extra damage is great. So I would probably rather play Ragnar against Kith than Cato against Kith, but Cato has advantages of his own in that matchup because his ability to get money when you destroy an enemy unit can quickly get out of control if you land like, if you even land a single AoE against Dark Eldar, you could well be making 4 or 5 resources in one attack, and that can be a giant swing. So while I think that like Cato against Eldorath and Cato against Kith might be somewhat disadvantaged matchups, I'd be surprised if it was like, I think it's probably like a 40-60 matchup or something like that. And a 40-60 matchup is pretty good.
Sure.
Like you might be at a disadvantage, but it's not going to be a big disadvantage. And Cato's versatility means that like almost every matchup is going to be either pretty even or a somewhat advantaged matchup.
Right. Well, I suppose since we've touched quite a bit on just basic gameplay strategy, the different strengths of the Space Marines faction, you happen to mention that Cato has a somewhat higher cost curve than does Ragnar. Granted, his signature army unit, Sicarius' Chosen, costs 1 more resource than does the Black Mane Sentinel. It's nevertheless a little bit more durable, even though it doesn't have that relocation ability. I suppose, what are some of those staple units that you tend to include within a Cato deck?
Yeah, so with a Cato deck, you do start out with a slightly higher cost curve than Ragnar does. You're generally going to be relying a little bit on your Warlord ability to generate some extra resources for you and accommodate that higher cost curve. And you're going to want to play kind of the standard sorts of Space Marine staple cards. You're going to be wanting to play 3 copies of Tactical Squad Cardenas. That's an extremely solid card. You can use as a cheap capping unit, or you can use it as a really good combat unit with that AoE.
Sure.
You're going to want to play, Honored Librarian. That's an extremely effective unit, especially in big battles. You're going to want to play Igor Recruit as, a combat trick. You're going to probably want to play some of the Blood Angels Veterans Imperial Fist Siege Force. Generally, the core of the Cato deck is going to be Space Marine units, and specifically Space Marine units, so that you can use them with Indomitable and Drop Pod Assault and so on.
Definitely.
Most of which are going to cost 1 to 3. One thing is that in some cases, Rogue Trader might not be as good for a Cato deck as it is in some other decks, because you have that ability to generate extra resources.
Sure.
So I've often played a deck that has no Rogue Traders or fewer Rogue Traders, and instead runs 10th Company Scout, the just like cheap body for Marines, which is further good because it has a good synergy with Veteran Brother Maxos, a card that I'm on and off on including in a Ragnar deck, but in a Cato deck is great because you can use the resources that you win in the middle of a battle to pull in more units.
Right, you can replenish your depleted battlefield forces.
Yeah, there's also a really good trick you can do with Veteran Brother Maxos, and not everyone's actually aware that this is a thing you can do, but if you have Veteran Brother Maxos on the planet adjacent to the planet where a big battle is taking place, and the enemy has some important unit that is going to be hard to deal with,
Right.
You can use Veteran Brother Maxos to deploy Sicarius' Chosen to the adjacent planet and use Sicarius' Chosen's reaction to pull that enemy unit out of the battle that you want to and onto this other planet, which probably doesn't even have a battle.
Right. I could definitely see that being a very unexpected and nasty surprise to drop on some opponent in a tournament.
Yeah, it's a strong play, and it's not one that people always see coming.
Definitely. Well, I suppose just on the topic of Space Marine units, before we jump to supports, events, and allied cards, what are your thoughts on some of the more expensive potential contenders, like the Space Wolves Predator, or anything along those lines, those really expensive cards?
Yeah, so I think broadly speaking, in terms of the units that are like 5 cost and above, the elite units, there are some interesting selections. You have the Land Raider. The Land Raider is very hard to kill, and its ability can be extremely useful. I used to run this unit at 1 or 2 copies in all Cato decks, especially because it helps a lot with the Eldar and Dark Eldar matchups, which I was mentioning earlier as being a little harder.
Certainly.
One thing that many people don't necessarily realize is that if you have a Land Raider coming with you from HQ, Eldorath actually can't use his Warlord ability at all on the planet that you move to if you don't have any other vehicles there. Because even though the Land Raider is already exhausted, its ability is just a constant effect that's always on.
Right.
So that has been an unpleasant surprise for a few Eldar opponents. And similarly, if you're playing against Dark Eldar, often you really want to protect your area of effect units because those will destroy the low HP Dark Eldar army. And an opponent that might want to play Archon's Terror or a card like that on your tactical squad instead has to use something to deal with the Land Raider first. That said, I haven't been playing Land Raider as much recently simply because Klavex War Leader is an extremely powerful card and is a really good counter to expensive high hit point units in particular.
Most definitely.
And since I was broadly including Land Raider for that Dark Eldar matchup, now that Klavex is in the game, I feel like it's lost a little bit of its luster there.
Sure.
The expensive unit I most like with Cato is the Fire Drake Terminators. That's a relatively new card from the Warlord cycle.
Right.
And it's very strong against swarms because its ability actually takes effect before you take damage from enemies attacking you. You actually pick them off, and if they don't have shields or something to protect their units, they're going to die before they can damage you. So
Sure.
if you're playing against like Zogwart, someone could have a literally infinite number of snotlings against your Fire Drake Terminators, and you're going to win unless they have a shield for every one of the attacks they need to make.
Right. I mean, it's an absolutely devastating effect relative to something like a repulsor impact field that actually necessitates that unit that has the attachment actually does take damage. So the fact that you're potentially destroying those attackers as soon as they're declared just seems absolutely invaluable in a lot of different matchups.
Oh yeah, it's very strong. The repulsor impact field hits harder, but it also hits afterwards, and if the attack kills you, it doesn't get a chance to go off.
Exactly.
So it's much weaker than this effect, even though the damage is lower. The other really nice thing about the Fire Drake Terminators is that its ability works with Crushing Blow. So if someone attacks you with a unit that has 2 HP left, are they going to shield that? Frequently they're not, and if you have a Crushing Blow, you can kill them without, again, preventing them from hitting you. I've killed librarians, I've killed, Aunshi with, units that are going to hit me with, 7 damage. I had a game where I killed a marksman with 2 ion rifles on it by hitting him with Crushing Blow after the guy took the 1 damage. It's really a nasty surprise for people, and it's another thing that's going to make them, they might have to preemptively spend shield cards, or if they're out of shield cards, you can just suddenly achieve big blowout plays that people are not anticipating.
Right, and I was just gonna say, even if a player happens to be savvy and understands that that's a possibility, it's nevertheless all the more pressure on them to keep using shields freely, even if you don't happen to have a Crushing Blow in your hand at the time.
Yeah, as you say. A lot of the cool things about Cato are things that allow you to exert a lot of pressure on the opponent and make him worry about what you might have access to.
Definitely, kind of instilling that sense of fear into your opponent.
The Space Wolves Predator is another one that you mentioned, and that card can be very strong. I've played with it and had great results. There are some situations where it basically just says you win the game.
Right.
Like you put it down on the planet they need to go to, and they can't go there. That's often just game over. The problem that I have with it is that it's so expensive. At 7 resources, you have to end the turn with 3 resources and not play anything else in order to play it. It's tough. It's tough to fit into the deck just because its cost is so high, even with Cato's extra means of making money. But I think that if you have a deck that has extra good means of making money, maybe you're playing the cost-reducing support or even a Prometheum Mine, or maybe you're leaving those traders in there instead of running scouts or a similar unit. If you can make the money for it, the Space Wolves Predator can be a giant swing, and very few people see it coming. Also, there's nothing they can do about it even if they do see it coming, because you just play it, the reaction goes off, and they can't go there.
Well, most definitely. I suppose, just on that same topic of deck construction, what do you do in regard to, you've mentioned the obvious Space Marine staple events like Drop Pod Assault, Indomitable, but what about supports and cards of that nature, apart from army units?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting question there. I tend to not run supports in Cato in almost any layout. Like, regardless of alliance, I pretty much just leave Cato's Stronghold in there. I occasionally have played Catachan Outpost when I'm using Imperial Guard allies, but that's not always the case. I'm sorry, Astra Militarum allies. We got to get with the times here. But that's not usually the case. And I think the main difference is that if I'm playing with Tau allies, I tend to field a larger number of attachments, whereas if I'm playing with Imperial Guard allies, I tend to field a larger number of events. And the reason for the increased number of attachments is, of course, so that the Earthcast technicians have more targets they can pull out. For instance, I for a while was playing a Cato Tau deck that featured 2 copies of, I forget what the name is, but the Storm Bolter card that lets a unit basically attack twice.
The Nocturne Ultima Storm
Yeah,
Bolter,
Nocturne Ultima, that's right. So I was playing 2 or 3 copies of that, and additionally Iron Halo, which I tend to dislike, but can come in handy in some situations.
Sure.
And the reason I was doing that is, these are 2 shield cards that can be pulled by those technicians, and it just gives you a better chance of getting card advantage and getting useful stuff out there. Whereas if I'm using Imperial Guard allies and I'm not worrying about pulling attachments, I'm going to tend to field a few more events. And Space Marines have tons of good events. It's really a question of determining which events you're going to have room for with all the units that you want to play. But you got Indomitable, you got Crushing Blow, you got Drop Pod Assault. You might want to run a single copy of Exterminatus to keep people on their toes.
Right.
You might want to
run another fear instilling card in and of itself.
You might want to run a copy of Primal Howl or 2. That can be a pretty strong event, and additionally it's 2 shields. You really have a lot of options in terms of events. And then, if you're playing with Imperial Guard allies, you also have the option of running Suppressive Fire, which can be a strong trick, and you can put in Elysian Assault Team, which I basically consider an event because it's a unit that doesn't have command icons and is extremely inefficient if you pay it for its normal price.
Right.
So I basically consider that to be an event or like a combat trick in the same way that I would consider an Indomitable to be an event.
Sure. Kind of like a Tau player generally wouldn't consider something like a gun drones necessarily an army unit, just because of that.
Yeah, if I'm making a Shadow Sun deck, I'm not considering gun drones I'm considering gun drones to contribute more to my attachments than it does to my units, because that's the way that I'm going to want to play it in most situations.
Sure. Well, I suppose while we're talking about, say, allies, what is your preference nowadays, given our current card pool? Are you more an Astra Militarum man, or are you seeking to promote the greater good?
I am an Astra Militarum man through and through these days. I think in the core set meta, the Tau had more on offer, because all the really strong Tau cards that you want to put in, that are good alliance cards that fit into almost any deck, have been in there since core. And the Astra Militarum, on the other hand, didn't start out quite as strong, but have added a bunch of quite strong cards since then, the most notable of which is Iron Guard Recruits. Iron Guard Recruits is incredibly good because it's another 2-for-2 unit. 2-for-2 is a term that I use, which means 2 cost, 2 command. So that's units like Iron Guard Recruits, Incubus Warrior, Sanctioned Psyker, Vashia Trailblazer, any of those units that cost 2 and have 2 command icons.
Sure.
I think those are some of the most core units to the way that the command struggle works in this game, because they're the cheapest units possible that are going to trump someone else's 1 cost, 1 command unit, which is like the most efficient way to get a planet for yourself.
Right.
So the core dynamic of the game in terms of the command struggle, at least for me, is trying to play a cheap unit to take the command, and then if your opponent does that, trying to play a only slightly more expensive unit to steal the command.
Right. I suppose just to try to maximize as much value in as many places as you possibly can.
Yeah. And Space Marines, in the core set environment, Space Marines had pretty weak command. They don't have a 2-for-2 unit and never have. They have had the same, 3-cost lieutenant profile as anyone else with Veteran Brother Maxos. But some people's lieutenants had useful abilities for winning command. For instance, Siren Zythlex means that it's extremely difficult for enemies to get icons onto that planet. And Crush Face means that it's cheaper for you to deploy more units to back him up if it looks like there's going to be a fight over the command at that place.
Right.
But Veteran Brother Maxos, while he does let you deploy those units as a surprise, you can only do that in the combat phase. There's no way to do that to steal commands from people.
Well, I suppose on this very subject, what are some additional areas of weakness or vulnerability for Cato? So he doesn't necessarily have the most in-faction command options, but are there any specific matchups or individual cards that really can pose a problem?
Yeah, so Space Marines don't have good in-faction command options, but they can get pretty good ones from their alliances, so that's not as much of an issue anymore.
Right.
They also they worry somewhat about certain types of big unit. Most big units are pretty easy to deal with, but large AoE attacks are pretty tough for Space Marines to deal with because a lot of their defense options, most notably Indomitable, rely on an attack coming in, and you can't use them against an AoE.
Sure.
Similarly, Space Marines tend to run a relatively high number of units that are going to cost, between 1 and 3, and I mean most people are doing this, but you're going to see a Space Marine army that has a bunch of units with, 2 or 3 hit points. So if you're facing, say, a Vicious Bloodletter, that has the potential to wipe out a big chunk of army. And Space Marines also don't have any ranged units whatsoever in their entire faction. So if your opponent's putting down a big AoE unit, you need to think about how you're going to counter that. And you do have the counters available, but it's on you to figure out a counter, and it's a big problem that you have to solve. In the final match of Worlds last year, this is actually what got me. I had gotten myself into a very strong strategic position, except that Jeremy was able to counter my forces with a Daring Assault Squad, which is only an AoE 2. But AoE 2 is still enough to, pick off your Honored Librarians despite their defensive abilities and really devastate a lot of the cheap units that Space Marines have to offer.
Sure. I suppose, how do you fare against an on-she matchup, potentially dealing with the threat of, say, a Gun Drones augmented Armorbane unit?
Yeah, so if someone has a Gun Drones unit with Armorbane, you're going to have to you're going to have to look and see what you have on offer that can deal with that. So for Ragnar, you might go to that planet and hit him with Ragnar's reaction to try to finish him off. Maybe back it up with Crushing Blow if they shield one, or if they only shield one.
Right.
Or you might have a Rattling Deadeye or something in a Ragnar deck that you could buff with Catachan Outpost and take the shot. Whereas with Cato, you might have to use Sicarius' Chosen. The one other thing that Space Marines have to deal with these things is that you have the ability to deploy a lot of units in the middle of fights. With Veteran Brother Maxos, Eager Recruit, and Drop Pod Assault, you have an unusually high number of ways to put new units in. So there have been some situations where someone has gotten off the big AoE and it's killed 3 or 4 of my units, but I've had another 2 or 3 units coming in mid-battle that have reinforced me and let me win the fight.
Sure.
I do tend to think that Aoun-Shi in particular is a relatively easy matchup for Space Marines, because Aoun-Shi does not have staying power, broadly speaking, and a lot of the relatively core Space Marine units are pretty tough for him to deal with, If you play a Tactical Squad Cardenas, that has 3 HP. If you're using that to capture a planet, Aoun-Shi can't kill it.
Right.
He has to have some orbital cities or similar tricks that are going to let him go there and swing multiple times. If he goes there to snipe, it's yeah, you did 2 damage to my unit, but I'm still here and you're not, so I'm still going to win this planet. And
Definitely.
then Indomitable is a huge card against Aoun-Shi. Aoun-Shi makes up for his lack of staying power by hitting really hard, and usually in a way that can't be countered, but Space Marines have a counter available, so that can be tough for him.
Well, and it's definitely a somewhat respectable win record that you've managed to amass yourself against On-Shi. So.
Yeah, so that was a little controversial online. I had posted my win record against Aoun-Shi, which I believe at the time was 43-1 or something like that. I'll tell you that since then I've won some games, but I've also lost another game. I believe my Aoun-Shi record is currently 52-2, which is to say my record against Aoun-Shi with other Warlords. I'm gonna say it right here. This might be controversial. I don't think Aoun-Shi is good. I think that Aoun-Shi is extremely lethal if you don't know what he can do and aren't prepared for it. But I think that if you are prepared for it, unless he gets a really dream combo,
right,
you can outlast him and you can win the game. And thus far, I've been quite successful against Aoun-Shi, both on Octagon and in tournament play around here. It's possible that people have figured out some Anshi strategies that I don't know how to deal with. There are people that I haven't played on Octagon, in some other area of the country that I haven't played in tournaments either, and that they're going to show up one day and kick my ass. But
Sure.
thus far, I do not consider Anshi an incredibly credible warlord. He's the only of the warlords that has won more than 2 regionals that I think is perhaps not actually in the top tier. I
Well,
think that if you're talking only about like a very high level of play, I would personally not include Anshi among the other warlords as one that I would want to take to a big tournament.
Well, I suppose really all that I can say, since I don't happen to have that incredible amount of experience myself to mention at all, is it definitely seems like there is just so much rewarding of a skillful and knowledgeable player in this game, and so much ultimately does come down to making the right choices at the right time. I find it very unsurprising that Anshi is very easily able to capitalize on a player that might not know to anticipate each and every move, so I could certainly see there being a big difference between Anshi running up against a relatively experienced player such as yourself and more novice such as the person speaking right now. But I suppose any other areas of concern, any other weaknesses or poor matchups you feel are worth Cato players being made aware of?
This is less as a matchup and more a playstyle thing. A lot of people use Sicarius' Chosen to try to snipe off 1 health units, especially units that have 1 health and 2 command icons like Vashia Trailblazer or Incubus Warrior.
Right.
In general, I don't consider this an incredibly strong move. There are some cases where it is, like if you have a promotion of your own to play in case they shield. But I think that there is a high risk of the person shielding in that situation.
Definitely.
And usually if I play Cato and I'm doing that, I'm hoping that they don't shield. So if you're playing against Cato and you find someone trying to snipe off your Trailblazer or snipe off your Incubus with a Chosen, I would definitely advocate shielding if you have availability of that. I think it's a strong play in that situation.
Well, and it certainly sounds like you're advocating, having backup or contingency plans for if your initial attempts at countering or routing your opponent don't exactly go as planned.
Yeah. Oh,
Uh-huh.
well, actually, one other thing. I think that generally speaking, Cato is somewhat weak to ranged units, more so than Ragnar is. Ragnar has 2 things going for him against ranged units. One is that his Warlord ability happens before any other attacks and can often pick off a ranged unit, which tend to have low HP.
Certainly.
And the other is that Ragnar is himself much more likely to play Catachan Outpost and Rattling Deadeye, at least in the decks that I've seen people using, than Cato is. So he's
Right.
more likely to have ranged of his own to counter enemy ranged units. I think that I used to play Viorla Marksman with Cato, would sometimes put ion rifles on him for a strong ranged attack, but I haven't been doing that as much more recently. And I think that if you have a strong ranged threat, Cato's going to have a relatively hard time to deal with it. Kind of the worst case scenario for Cato is if you're playing like a Tau deck, either Shadow Sun or Aoun-Shi, and you have Ambush Platform that is going to turn a ranged unit into a ranged AoE unit by playing a gun drones during combat.
Right.
It's relatively hard for Cato to deal with that unless he has like the flood of mid-battle deployments that I was alluding to earlier, or has the ability to pull off the Maxos Sicarius' Chosen combo to redirect that unit away and hopefully deal with it later.
Right. Well, I suppose in regard to just general gameplay strategy, apart from some of the things you've already shared, are there any other kind of fundamental keys to success that you feel are worth conveying to the community? Like any just basic gameplay tips or advice?
Basic gameplay tips are, yeah, okay, so here's one. One of the biggest mistakes that I see people doing is sending their warlord too often to planets where they're already winning command. I think sometimes this is good, but broadly speaking, as a rule of thumb, especially during the early game, don't put your warlord at a planet where you're already winning command. Send him to a planet where your opponent is winning command so that you maximize the effect of that snipe. This isn't always true, but it's usually true, and I think people don't fully understand that in this game. And it's a common mistake that I see new players make is setting up so that they have a stronger army on Planet 1. They have more command and better units, and then also sending their warlord there just to really lock in that win. And usually winning planets, especially early in the game, is going to be less important than winning command. So I would say that you should always look and see what influence your warlord can have on the command struggle, not just on the battles.
Definitely. I suppose we've already mentioned a great number of different powerful card combinations and synergistic effects, but any other tricks when it comes to Cato that you feel are worth making mention of, or have we already covered most of the bases here?
I guess I'll mention two other combos, and these aren't like huge combos, but they're still pretty cool stuff. One of they both have to do with Cato's signature things. So if you have Talisarian Tempest Blade out, against decks that don't have Indomitable or Rockcrete Bunker or any similar card that can just outright prevent damage, you know that you can reliably kill an enemy unit with Cato's attack, and there's nothing they can do about it.
Right.
So I found that there are really a few things you can do with that. One is if they have a dangerous unit that has too high HP for Cato to kill in one hit, you can hit it for the guaranteed damage, and that guarantees that you're going to be able to play Fury of Sicarius. It guarantees that you're going to be able to play Crushing Blow, because they aren't going to be able to prevent the damage from that attack.
Certainly.
Another thing along a similar vein is that if I've been in a few situations, most notably against Vicious Bloodletter when that was more commonly played, where the opponent had the initiative and had the Bloodletter out, and I didn't have any way to deal with it with ranged. So what I did was I played my Sicarius' Chosen on the next planet to move them over and deal 1 damage, and then the 1 damage that the Chosen dealt was enough that it meant on the next turn when I had initiative, I could send Cato there and get the guaranteed kill with the Tempest Blade.
Right.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to mention, another strong combo, is that a lot of people don't play Cato's Stronghold very creatively, which is to say that they frequently attack with a unit and then use Cato's Stronghold to ready the same unit that just attacked. It doesn't have to be the same unit. In a lot of situations, it's better to do a different unit. I find that it's a frequent trick that people don't necessarily plan for or don't anticipate is to use Cato's Stronghold to ready a unit that came to the battle with you from HQ.
Right.
And, let's say I swing with Cato, with Tempest Blade and kill someone's unit. I might want to ready Cato. There's situations where I might want to do that. Or, maybe I have an AoE unit that I'd rather attack with, and I'd rather ready that unit instead.
Definitely.
Being a little creative with the units that you can buff with that can be really good. And if you can use that to get a surprise AoE, AoEs win big battles, like plain and simple. And if you're getting a Daring Assault Squad or even just a Tactical Squad Cardenas to get an AoE hit your opponent isn't expecting, that can often be the difference between a win and a loss.
Well, and you've already shared just a myriad number of specific experiences where you've been able to, I think it's safe to say, outplay or outmaneuver an opponent that may not know any better, but what are some of your absolute favorite memories or gameplay experiences in the, I would imagine at this point, countless or numberless games of Conquest that you've played?
Yeah. What are some of my favorite gameplay moments, especially with... I think the last game between Jeremy Zwern and I in Worlds of last year is still one of the best games of Conquest that I've ever played. I think that that was a Cato mirror match, so there's a lot of cool Cato tricks on display. It was a long game. It went all the way to turn 7. We both had some moments where we got lucky, and we both had some moments where we got unlucky. And I think that that game overall is one of my favorites. Jeremy is a great player. I look forward to a potential rematch with him at future tournaments because I think he's a great player and I loved playing against him.
Definitely. I suppose any other matches stand out in your mind that don't necessarily happen to have the title of world champion on the line?
Yeah. I had a very interesting game. I had a very interesting game on Octagon the other day. I was actually playing with Cato in that game, and it was a very strong comeback game that I had against, actually against Aon Shi. I got bloodied very early in the game, but I managed to pull it back by just using, every trick that I could to save myself.
Right.
And in the end, I managed to win on, I believe, Planet 6. And if it had gone to 7, I would have been killed for certain. Because I was out of Indomitables, and he was going to have the initiative and have a ranged unit there that was going to be able to snipe me off. But that's a pretty recent game, and it wasn't for the World Championships. But I really like Cato's versatility and his ability to adapt to situations. I think that he has a better ability to make comebacks than most Warlords in the game, because his card set provides you with an answer to almost any situation if you have the right stuff and know what you're doing. In that game, the key play was the Maxos Chosen combo, which I was able to do to move. A guy had just a Virula marksman, but he had the gun drones on it, and he ambush platformed another gun drones onto it for an AoE 4, which would have destroyed me at this key battle that I needed to win, or he was going to lose the game. But I had Maxos on the next planet, and I did the Cato Sicarius' Chosen combo to send the marksman over to that next planet.
Certainly.
And he allowed the damage, and then I played Crushing Blow on it to finish off the unit. So with that one play, I had taken out not only his unit that was going to win that fight, but I had also caused him to lose 2 gun drones outright, and he didn't have them for the next turn either. And then I was able to take the game on that next turn. And that was a huge play, and I was very excited by it.
Well,
yeah,
it certainly sounds like a hell of a game, to be sure.
Yeah, I think that I'll say this in Anshi's favor. A lot of the games that I have played against him and won have been very close. He really does have some very mean tricks. I have found that in general I've been able to adapt to those tricks and keep on going and usually get the win. But he has a tough array of tricks to deal with, and I think you definitely have to be on the top of your game to deal with an Aonshi player who is on the top of his game, or some good combos that he's drawing into at the very least.
Sure. Well, I suppose just to draw things to their unfortunate but inevitable close here, kind of vague or general question, do you have any advice for someone looking to become a more competitive player? Like maybe someone that's interested in Conquest, they're playing, but is curious about being more competitive in a tournament context. Like any advice for how to take your gameplay and escalate it to just a more serious, advanced, and intimidating, threatening level.
Yeah, so I think Conquest has a very friendly community overall. I think there's a lot of people who are happy to help out new players, myself included, and I mean yourself included. You made a large number of videos that I think are very helpful for people that are relative newcomers and kind of trying to get a feel for what different things are.
Well, thank you very much.
I think specifically if you're a new player that's trying to become more competitive, I think that the best way to learn quickly is to find good players and play against them. And so if you have a good local group of people, find some people and just get playing. And if you're having games where you're losing or that seem frustrating, ask yourself, what could I have done that would have made that game go better? And that could be a play choice, that could be like a deck building choice, that could be a bunch of different things. And if you're finding you're not making too much progress with that, I advocate asking your opponent what they thought you could have done better. It's frequently the case that a game that looks like it was like a really crushing victory,
right?
It could be that you had fallen for some bluffs and the opponent's position was much more tenuous than you thought. The one other thing I'll recommend is there's a thing called Octagon. I believe you actually have a video that shows people how to set up Octagon and how to play games on there.
I do not. That's been a very controversial subject. One day I may put one together, but...
My mistake.
Oh, no problem. No problem at all.
Well...
But there certainly is one out there if people are interested.
Yeah, so I guess it won't be found on this channel, but there's some channel where you can find a video or some site where you can find a guide as to how to play on Octagon.
Right.
And Octagon is very useful. I play the majority of my games on there myself because it makes it extremely easy to test new decks since you don't have to physically assemble the decks, and you can play against people from anywhere in the world. So I think playing games on Octagon lets you play more than you would otherwise, and that it lets you test things and change decks that you're testing faster than you would be able to otherwise. That's a great way to get a bunch of games in and improve quickly. When I played at Worlds in 2014, I had not played at any tournament before. I had played about 6 games in person before, but I had played, probably 100 games on Octagon or something like that.
Sure.
And if I had not been able to use that to play those extra games, I think I would have done much worse in that tournament. And I think that it's a great way to get experience. But when you get right down to it, playing on Octagon and doing stuff like that can only take you so far. There are a lot of good players on Octagon, but the average player on Octagon is not necessarily going to be all that great. So really the best tip I can offer is to find other good players around you or other good players that you can meet up with on Octagon or via Skype or some other tool to play games with, because the best way to get better is to play against other good people and learn through that.
Well, most definitely, and I can attest to, were it not for having a digital option for playing the game, I most likely would not be online making these videos now, just because I have no local player pool whatsoever. But through the magic of the internet, here I am talking to, one of the, frankly, again, world's best Conquest players in all likelihood. So it's a stellar program. Whether or not Fantasy Flight loves the fact that you can play their game online or not, it's definitely a fantastic option that we have as a community, and hopefully it's not going to be going anywhere anytime soon. But I suppose anything else at all you'd like to throw out there before we bring things to a close? Again, I can't express enough how much I appreciate your willingness to come on and conduct one of these spotlights.
I'd like to, so I have 2 quick things. First thing, I was just talking about Octagon. If you play on Octagon, buy all the cards.
Sure.
Don't not buy cards so that you can play online. Buy the game, show your support to Fantasy Flight, fund future development of stuff like that. I think there's some controversy about Octagon and things like it. There's the potential for basically piracy, people playing the game without paying for any of it. Don't be like that. Buy the cards, support Fantasy Flight. They're a great company. Yeah. So I think that's about all I have to say on that one. And then one other note, I'd like to give an anti-shout-out to the card Superiority. Don't put Superiority to your deck. It's not good. I see a lot of people playing this. Whenever my opponent plays Superiority on me, I'm happy because it almost always means that they have other bad cards in their deck too. Don't play Superiority in your decks. That has nothing to do with Cato at all. I just want to give that shout-out to the community. And I suspect there's going to be a little controversy around that statement, but I'm just going to say it straight out. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Do not put Superiority in your deck. Thank you.
Well, shots fired. I suppose any other controversial claims you'd like to make before we bring this video to its ultimate conclusion?
Imperial Guard are much better than people think. They currently don't have a warlord that's clearly in the top tier, but both Straken and Katias are much better than their regionals performance would indicate. I suspect the reason these warlords haven't won more is because few people play them, but if you give Straken or especially Katias a shot, you might be surprised at what they can do. I think they're both very strong.
Definitely. I've mentioned it before, but I definitely think that seeing as how our community is able to so readily interact through, the immense online player database, once the spirit of the community kind of starts to turn against a warlord, I think the rate at which they can fall out of favor and essentially be abandoned is astounding. So
yeah, that's definitely right. And I also want to say this game is in a really good state balance wise. I was playing Netrunner at a relatively similar time in Netrunner's life. We were seeing a similar number of players at big tournaments and at small tournaments and stuff like that.
Right.
And I'll tell you that at this stage in Netrunner's life, right after the first cycle, the meta was so much smaller than it is in Conquest in terms of what was viable. So at this point in Netrunner's life, there are 3 runner factions. One of them was completely invalid and wasn't good until the big box came out. Another one was being carried entirely by one identity, which noise, which made it so you could basically like luck out sometimes and win. And the third one was really good. And in terms of the corpse, one of the corpse was unplayable, one of the corpse was kind of playable, and 2 of the corpse were good. And most of the factions, even the good ones, only had like one valid identity. In Conquest, way more factions are viable and way more warlords are viable, even within factions. It's great. I think Conquest is in an excellent place. I can't wait to see what things come out going forward, but I think we should... I know there's a lot of discussion about who's the best, what's at the top of the top tier or whatever. I think that it can be useful to take a step back and realize that the overall state of balance in Conquest is really good. And we should be thankful to Brad and the rest of the design team over at Fantasy Flight for making such a fun and well-balanced game for us all.
Well, I mean, I most definitely agree. It seems like it would be an absolute balancing nightmare in that there are so many faction options, there are different ally options, there are warlords, there are signature squads, there are cards released on, for all intents and purposes, what's meant to be a monthly basis, so it just seems like a staggering amount of concentrated effort that has to go into creating a game like this that is as well balanced as it is, and all the same, to ooze theme, to appeal to casual players, to appeal to ultra-competitive tournament-style players. I just think the designers have done an absolutely commendable job, so...
Absolutely.
I can't say enough good things about this game, so I suppose anything else, or shall we sign off?
I think that about covers it.
Alright, well then I will just end by saying thank you once again. Thank you so much for coming on. I very much appreciate your time and experience and expertise, and I wish you the best of luck at Gen Con.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, take care, good sir, and I'll see you around the community.
See ya.
Well, now that our interview has ultimately come to a close, I'll just wrap up this video by saying thank you once again for watching. Do be sure to leave a comment sharing your own thoughts, opinion, perspective, and experience when it comes to Captain Cato Sicarius and the Space Marine faction as a whole. Interaction with viewers such as yourself is the absolute highlight of my creating and maintaining this channel, so please take a moment to let me know what you thought of this interview and which warlord you'd like to see me cover next. If you do happen to know someone that might make a good candidate for a future interview, be sure to share. But with that said, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you have not done so already. Please feel free to contact me directly and keep in touch through any social media outlet you'd like. But in any case, thank you once again for watching, and be sure to check back again soon for ever more Conquest content to come.